So in last lecture, we discussed the meaning of public finance, and then we discussed like the word that we were telling that public finance is a misnomer because it actually discusses the use of the real resources and it goes beyond the monetary dimension, and that's why people also prefer to use the word public sector economics and or simply public economics. And I had also told you that a Nobel laureate economist, Joseph Stiglitz, who has written a book titled The Economics of Public Sector, and that's a very popular book in public finance. And then we started the discussion on scope of public finance, and then we started with the difference between the positive analysis and normative analysis. Normative analysis basically says that what ought to be, and the positive economic analysis says what is. Okay? It discusses the reality. Okay? And then we had given the examples, and then we had also discussed that public economics uses microeconomic principles to study the behavior of the government. It also studies the macroeconomic functions like the taxation, spending, monetary policies, and then we also discussed the methodological basis, and that how it is basically considered as applied microeconomics, and it discusses the social desirability of alternative states. Okay, like we have discussed the Pareto efficient allocation, okay, and Pareto inefficient, Pareto improvement, and we discussed basically the definition of Pareto optimality. Whenever we use the word efficiency, we refer to the Pareto optimality. And just to have a quick recap, the definition says that given the resource endowment and technology, the resources are allocated in such a manner that no one can be made better off without making somebody else worse off. But then Pareto efficient might be insensitive towards the distributive aspects, and that is why we discussed that Pareto efficiency, of course, takes a lot of assumptions. One is that perfect competition, and usually it is believed that the free enterprise systems are amazingly productive, but in reality, actually, the markets are not competitive or they are not really free. Okay, and we discussed that okay, even if those assumptions are fulfilled, then Pareto efficiency might not be socially desirable. Okay, and that is why there is a need for the role of government. Okay, and then other way also market will not be competitive. It could be monopoly, or it could be imperfect competition, where there could be duopoly, there could be oligopoly, there could be monopsony, there could be duopsony. So there are different forms of market which are basically not either competitive or monopoly. They are in between competitive and monopoly, and most of the markets are in between. Okay? And that's why we also discuss that whenever there is a monopoly, there will be welfare loss because the prices will be very high and the quantity of output will be quite low. So in that context, we need to have government intervention. And then we discuss the market failure, and so in that context we discuss okay, what is market failure. Market failure is basically that when the market fails to provide the socially desirable level of public good at socially desirable level of prices, that is called basically market failure. In fact, in the previous slide, I don't know whether I told this concept or not, but even if I have not told, you can remember this, that very often in economics or even in media also, sometimes when people from economics background write some article, you will read this word market failure. And market failure is that when the market fails to provide socially desirable level of output at socially desirable level of prices, that is called as market failure. And to give an example, I can tell you that see, market can also provide education, and if you allow the market to provide education, what will it do? It will definitely provide education, and that will be supplied only in a few pockets, like in cities or in towns or in market areas, and the people only who are rich can only afford that because the prices will be quite high. And so I told that two dimensions, that socially desirable level of output, that what is socially desirable of output here in case of education, that education should be available to all. But if allow the market will not be able to provide this commodity to everyone. Now, it is unfortunate that I am using the word commodity in for education, which is not true. It has a very strong ideological position. When I say commodity, many people will oppose this, and I of course absolutely do not agree with that. But just for analysis as well, I am telling this, that the market will not be definitely able to provide the socially desirable level of our commodity. That means education cannot reach to all sections of the society. So that means it is failing to provide the socially desirable level of output. Then it should be provided at socially desirable level of price, but then market charges at a very high rate. So that is basically called as market failure. And in some other cases also, market fails because market does not exist, the price does not exist, and if the price does not exist, then no one can come forward to provide that commodity. And there are many examples. For example, the clean air. Okay, and for clean air, unfortunately, there is no market, and that is why we all are freely polluting it. And that's why I have told in many examples that if we do not take care of the atmosphere, uh, it will not be that late actually when we will have to carry an oxygen cylinder, like the way we are carrying water bottles with us. Okay. So, in economics, we also discuss the public expenditure, the theories of public expenditure, and in that we discuss the public goods. And I also discussed the difference between public good, private good, merit good, and club goods. And then externality we discussed, positive externality, negative externality, and then we discussed the social insurance, then income redistribution. And we also said that it's not that government is omnipotent. Okay, government can also fail. Okay, like the market fails, government can also fail. Okay, the role of government arises because the market fails, and but it's not wise to say that government can do everything perfectly. And in that context, also discussed that why this happens, because bureaucracy tries to do a lot of things at a time, and lack of specialization and lack of manpower also. So, and then imperfect information also. So all these things lead to a failure in the market. And again, for your information, let me tell you that the size of bureaucracy in India is one of the lowest in the world. Why I'm saying this, size of bureaucracy is lowest, one of the lowest actually in the world. If you take the statistics now, of course, I do not have the exact number, but I remember, I read somewhere that the number of government officials per 1 lakh population is one of the lowest in India. If we want to provide good public goods or services to the people, we need to have a good number of people in the bureaucracy or in the government, so that they can operate efficiently. But unfortunately, that is not happening because of lack of resources. People do not pay tax, or government is not able to raise tax from different sources, and that is why government has limited resources, and that's why we have a small bureaucracy. And again, they are given all kind of jobs, so they are not able to focus on things. In fact, very recently, I'm also reading Indian economic history. Now, there I was reading is how uh, the position of collector came, tahsildars came. And that was there in 19th century also, when the British started ruling India. They had created all these positions just to collect revenue, land revenue, for the British government, and those positions are now continuing, and a lot of responsibilities have been added to their positions. So they are not able to perform much satisfactorily because of that only. Okay, and then we had gone to this much that theory of taxation, that public economics or public finance also discusses the theory of taxation, and in that we discuss the tax incidence, because there are two types of taxes: direct tax and indirect tax. And then tax incidence, in case of direct tax, actually it could be that wherever actually you are imposing basically that economic incidence and the legal incidents, or statutory incidents we had discussed. That the statutory incidents basically indicates that who is legally responsible for the tax is paying the tax. Okay, no, that is the statutory incidence of a tax indicates who is legally responsible, but the economic incidence of a tax is the change in the distribution of private real income induced by the tax. And the difference between direct tax and indirect tax is that the burden and the real incidence are the final, the tax incidence and the real burden is on two different persons. So that means statutory incidence will be on somebody, but the real burden is on somebody. And that is in case of indirect tax. You can transfer the burden to somebody else, but you cannot do that in case of a direct tax. Then we discuss excess burden, that when government imposes a tax, the burden that is created is much more than the amount of tax collected. Usually we'll be believing that if government imposes 10 rupees tax, then the burden would also be 10 rupees on people. But it is not true. If you estimate the real burden that is going to the society, then the burden is much more than the tax quantity. And that is why it is called as excess burden. What is that? Because in any tax mechanism, in case of particularly indirect tax, we will of course take direct tax. But in case of indirect tax, what happens? When government imposes a tax, the prices of the commodity rises, and as a result of which the consumer's preference is affected, and basically individuals switch from one commodity to the other, or they reduce the consumption of that quantity. And if they reduce the quantity consumption of the commodity, then what happens? The extra surplus that they used to derive actually that basically falls. And how do we estimate a consumer surplus? Let me tell you, if you have not studied economics, I can tell you the example of consumer surplus. So when you read newspaper, we pay 5 rupees or maybe even less than 5 rupees if you are reading Samaj. Yeah, it is 5 rupees. If you are reading Hindu, it is 10 rupees. Some other newspapers would cost a little bit different. And if you estimate the real utility that we derive from a newspaper, that is much more than 5 rupees or 10 rupees. So in that case, if somebody will ask you to pay a little higher, we may really pay, okay, but actually we do not pay. So that is one example. So that means we are willing to pay more quantity, or the utility that we are deriving from the newspaper is much more than 5 rupees or 10 rupees. People who are preparing for civil service, if you read newspaper intensively, then you can clear civil service, or basically your general knowledge improves significantly. But you are paying only 5 rupees or 10 rupees. So that means there is a huge surplus, or utility that you are deriving is much more than 5 rupees. So that is basically consumer surplus. So that consumer surplus exists in almost all the commodities. Okay? And because wherever you feel that there is no consumer surplus, you do not buy that commodity. And you remember I had given an example that when the onion price exceeds a limit, I do not buy. Basically, know that because I do not get that much utility from onion. So whenever I'm buying some commodity, or you are buying that commodity, you are feeling that the price that I am paying is worth the utility that I am getting from the commodity or from the service. So some consumer surplus already exists in that commodity. That's why you are buying that commodity. But when a tax is imposed and price has gone up, now your consumption will definitely fall. And as a result of which, the extra surplus that you are getting, extra utility that you are getting from the higher consumption quantity now is reducing. So you are losing that. So that is becoming excess burden. Okay. Similarly, for the producer, when producer was selling large quantity, he or she was getting more profit. But due to imposition of tax, Now the production, the sales will decline, and as a result of which, now the producer will also get less profit. So that means there was extra surplus from the from the producer. Now producer is getting less. So now both consumers and producers are losing because of imposition of tax, and that loss is much more than the tax that they are paying to the government. So that is known as excess burden. Same situation also arises in case of direct tax. In fact, in direct tax, what happens? You will realize as your salary increases, your real income does not increase because the government is imposing more and more tax. So what happens now? Many people would not will to work long hours, okay? And they would prefer to take rest, basically leisure. Say every individual enjoys 24 hours. Now you are dividing this 24 hours into work or leisure. Okay, now public finance theory tells that if you can tax both commodities, then the substitution effect will be less. So, for example, when we were discussing indirect tax or indirect tax, if there are 10 commodities available in the market, say X1, X2, up to X10 commodities are available in the market, then government should impose tax on all the commodities. The amount of tax would not be equal. That actually, I will go to discuss in the theory of optimal taxation. So let me tell you that so that it will be clear for you. But remember, okay, so in optimal taxes, what we try to do that government's objectives should be fulfilled, but the excess burden should not or should be minimized. Okay? Because I told that whenever government imposes a tax, there is an excess burden. Okay? And when government is imposing a tax, the ideal tax should minimize the excess burden so that welfare loss is minimum. But government always wants to maximize revenue. So these are no two different conflicting objectives that you want to raise revenue, but at the same time you do not want to reduce the welfare of the people, okay? And or basically the excess burden should be minimized. So how is that possible? So this is very difficult objective, two objectives which are very contrary to each other, but there has to be balance between these two, and that is basically optimal tax. That a tax that maximizes the revenue without and it basically reduces the excess burden, okay, or it creates the minimum level of distortion in the market. Okay? That means your substitution effect is minimum. See, when government is imposing a tax on commodity X, people may switch this consumption from X to Y. If people feel that no, government is collecting so much of tax on commodity X, then they will reduce the consumption of X and then switch over to Y. So in that case, government may lose revenue, right? So that is creating a distortion in the market. But theory of optimal tax says that such distortion should be minimum. Okay, that means government has to tax probably all the commodities. Okay, then only the substitution effect will be less. But then you cannot impose taxes equally on all the goods because the nature of goods are completely different. Some goods are considered necessary, some goods are considered luxuries, some commodities are considered as comfort. There could be other classifications also, but in simplistic form, we can say that either the commodities are necessary goods, or it gives comfort, or it is a luxurious commodity. Or you can also say that some addicted, or sin goods, okay, or bad goods. You can say, sin goods. Basically, you must be hearing or reading in the newspaper that all the smoking, all items which are basically are alcohol, then all commodities that are injurious to health are called as sin goods. Now you cannot tax all the commodities equally. That necessary, comfort, luxury, and sin goods should be taxed equally. Even sin goods also would be very much different. So for example, how will you tax a BD? How will you tax a cigarette? How will you tax alcohol? Then alcohols of different varieties, okay? And so you cannot tax equally all of them, because we also know that some common sin goods are used by poor people, some sin goods are used by rich people. So like that, taxes should be different. But then if you differentiate the tax, then the distortion would be very high. Okay? So that means your again objective is becoming conflicting. That no, when we are imposing differential tax, your excess burden is increasing, although you will be able to get more and more taxes. So this is basically discussed in the theory of optimal taxation. The theory of optimal taxation could be discussed in context of direct tax. It could also be discussed in case of indirect tax. In case of indirect tax, we have discussed a little bit. And then efficient taxes should distort decisions as little as possible, and efficient taxation requires that relatively high rate of taxation should be levied on goods whose demands are relatively unresponsive to their prices. Now, basically, we say that inelastic commodities should be taxed at a higher rate. But cannot do that. And what are those commodities which are inelastic in nature? Inelastic means that when we are imposing a tax, the demand does not change much. And if you're taxing those, and what are those commodities? The commodities, if you will see, basically the necessary commodities are relatively unresponsive to the prices. See, even if the prices of potato has gone up to 40 rupees, people are still buying it. Okay? Of course, onion people can say that no, I will become Jain, and then uh, people can take different other excuses, and people may not consume. But there are still some people who still continue that. So, let's say, for example, if you impose a tax on the rice, then what will happen? Uh, People will definitely consume rice, even if you reduce the consumption of other things. People cannot stop the consumption of the necessary commodities, and those are unresponsive to the prices. So, if you tax those commodities, a disproportionate burden will go to the ordinary people. That's why people say that a high. You can take an example. If there are two commodities X and Y, even if the demand for X is less responsive to the price than the demand for Y, optimal taxation may require a higher tax on X than Y. Basically, the commodity which is less responsive or inelastic in nature, that commodity should be taxed at a higher rate. And the commodity, basically, those are comfort or luxury. Basically, those should be taxed less, but that is unfortunate. So, but so the counter argument is that a high rate tax rate on Y creates a relatively large excess burden, but it also tends to redistribute income towards the poor. So in economics, we also use a theory called ability to pay theory, that the people who have higher ability to pay should pay more. Okay, that means it is only the rich people who buy the comfort or luxurious commodities should pay higher. Okay, not that the necessary commodities. Necessary commodities are consumed by everyone, of course. The poor people consume and as well as rich people consume. But then if you tax a large quantity, then the rich, then poor people pay a higher proportion, because the total income of the poor people are less, and when they are paying the same quantity as the rich people pay, then that means as in proportion they are paying higher quantity. To take an example, suppose a rich person is earning 1,000 rupees per month, and he is buying say 10 kg of rice worth 100 rupees, on which suppose a tax is imposed 10 rupees, then it is 10% tax on the commodity. But as in proportion to the income, he is paying only 1%, because it is 10 rupees from 1,000 rupees income, so 1%. But in case of a poor person who is earning 100 rupees, and he also has to buy rice worth 100 rupees, and he is also paying 10 rupees tax, then in absolute quantity he is paying same amount, but in proportion he is paying how much? He is paying 10% tax. So that means a rich person is paying 1% tax from his income. Now, a poor person is being asked to pay 10% tax from his income. That is unfair in the society. So in that case, there would be an argument that if you are taxing the inelastic commodities, then the poor people carry more burden. So usually the taxes should be such that there should be a redistributive objective. And I have told you also that theory of taxation is very complicated, because it has multiple objectives. That sometimes tax serves the regulatory objectives, sometimes tax serves the objective of revenue collection, sometimes tax serves the objective of redistributive objective, that is transferring resources from the rich to poor. Sometimes tax serves the purpose of reducing the consumption of certain things like the seen goods. Why every year the government imposes or increases the rate of tax on all the seen goods? The reason is that government wants to discourage the tax and discourage the consumption of those goods. So that means tax has multiple objectives, and you want to again have an optimal tax. How is that possible? Since the objectives become very so much, objectives are so much, the optimal tax also becomes complicated. Okay? Because if you have one or two objectives, you can probably arrive at an optimal tax. Now, if you say the people who are fond of mathematics, now you just put it in a functional form, that you have an objective function that is very here. Okay, if you have one objective function and you know multiple constants, then probably you can arrive at a solution. Or one objective function, one constant, that becomes even much simpler to solve the equation. But when you have multiple objectives and you have multiple constraints, then getting a solution actually becomes very difficult, complicated. And this is not simply purely mathematical, because it has a value added component also. That means there is subjectivity involved in it, because we are saying that tax also should serve the purpose of redistribution. That means rich people cannot be taxed, the same commodity should be taxed more. So these are all value judgment things actually we are using, and in that case, you cannot actually have simple objectives, and that's a solution. Getting a solution for optimal tax is very very difficult. So now, taxation amenities for horizontal equity. What is this actually? In fact, I don't know whether you have paid. No, you might not have paid tax. There might be some TDS from your salary because you have joined very recently. But at the end of the year, or people who are already in job, they must be aware of TDS, and the tax department or the employer sometimes tries to deduct tax that is called as uh, okay, it is tax on amenities, or sorry, the taxes on amenities on different parts. Okay, and what is that? Okay, let me give an example. Okay, now suppose you are living in a quarter. Basically, okay, taxation on perquisites, tax on perquisites. So, what is this tax on perquisites? Can somebody explain what is a perquisite and why it is taxed? Basically, that is basically the taxation of amenities for horizontal equity. Can somebody explain, if you are aware, tax on perquisite? Anybody? Are you all there?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please explain if somebody is aware of this thing, a tax on perquisite. Have you heard of this?
No, sir.
No?
No, sir.
Okay. I'll give an example. Earlier, I worked in Utkal University. In Utkal University, government used to provide us a quarter. Not government, basically the Utkal University provided a quarter to all the faculty members. And when sixth pay commission salary was given to all the teachers, sixth pay commission salary, then the house rent, somebody will be entitled for house rent would be something like, say, 10,000 rupees. No, I'm just giving an example. But the faculty members have got a quarter, so of course they do not pay any house rent. Okay, and because you are getting a quarter, so your house rent is not given to the employee. So now, if you get a house in Bhubaneswar city, like the quarter of Utkal University, that house would cost you minimum 20,000 rupees. The quarter of Utkal University is quite luxurious. You get a very big house, particularly the professors get a bungalow. Like all the secretaries get a big bungalow. they get a big bungalow with big lawn, almost 1 acre of land for each faculty member, and there will be a servant quarter, then for parking, for your study room. There are some 10 12 rooms actually in a bungalow. Those are constructed in 1960s, so that's how they had created these very luxurious houses. And that luxurious house will have, of course, those are not well maintained in the recent year, that is a different thing. But then if it is in a good condition, then that house would cost you minimum 20,000 rupees. But you are entitled for a house rent of only 10,000 rupees. So if government is giving you a better facility, that means you are getting a real income. Although it is not in kind, you are getting a real income. And that is now, that should be calculated as extra benefit that we are getting. That is basically called as perquisite. So now Utkal and Vishwahan taxed its employees, it would calculate that other than the salary, you have got this extra income for your house because you got a luxurious house. So now 10,000 rupees extra will be added to your salary. Okay, that is called as perquisite, and that government again will collect tax on that. Okay, that is called as perquisite tax. People always protest this, that how is it possible? You are not giving any income to us, and we are taxing it. But yeah, so these are basically the perquisite taxes. Now, for taxation of amenities and horizontal equity, for horizontal equity, tax on amenities should be there. Now, why actually we are saying this? Now, imagine the other employees who do not get such a house. Okay. Now, for them, their real income would be less, because suppose one person who is doing a job in government is getting a luxurious quarter, and that is why your extra income, real income, is 10,000 rupees. Monetary income is nothing, but you are getting extra real income, 10,000 rupees. But if a person who is working in a private sector is not getting a quarter, and in that case, to get similar kind of accommodation, he will have to spend another extra 10,000 rupees. So he is suffering a loss. So to make a balance, now two people may argue that, see, the private person who is earning same amount of income is having less welfare, but the person who is doing a government job is living in a luxurious government quarter. That's why his real income is higher. So if you want horizontal equity, particularly in terms of welfare, now this extra amenity that the person is getting, that should also be taxed. So that is why there is a perquisite tax. Okay, so when you are working as a tax officer, tax is not as simple as the way you collect it. Okay, now people who design a tax, they have to think in these terms. Then only they can arrive at an optimal tax. Now, okay, coming to the income tax, there are a lot of theory in public finance. We basically teach different theories on on theory of optimal tax. Those I'm not discussing here. Just I'm giving an idea actually what is the optimal tax all about. Okay, now coming to income tax, the Hague-Simons criteria requires the inclusion of all sources of potential increase in consumption, regardless of whether the actual consumption takes place and regardless of the form in which the consumption occurs. So, in income tax, that is why we take into consideration the wages, salaries, business profits, rents, royalties, dividends, and interest rate. Everything is included together. It's not that only the salary that you get, that is income tax. Okay, since I was discussing this theory of optimal tax, I told you that in case of commodities or in case of indirect tax, the theory of optimal tax says that both X and Y should be taxed such a way that the excess burden is minimized, and that commodity that is less elastic should be taxed in large quantity. Now, coming to income tax, in income tax, if you tax one person higher, then the real income, as I told you that when your income increases at a particular higher level, your tax rates actually are going up. That's why your real addition to your income is decreasing. And that is why people would not prefer to work longer hours, and that is why there will be preference for more leisure. So out of 24 hours, how long you will work in a day, that will be also affected due to taxation. And in such a case, economists argue that if you can also tax leisure, then only you can arrive at an optimal tax. But leisure cannot be taxed. If somebody is sleeping longer hours, can we tax him? You cannot do that. Okay. So that possibility does not exist. That is why getting optimal direct tax is quite complicated. Okay. Because when you are imposing more tax, people will switch over to leisure. People may not work longer hours. Uh, that means your incentive to do work will also reduce, okay, at higher level. When we are earning more and more, government is collecting more taxation, tax for income. Your incentive to work will fall because you will believe that no, one side I am earning more income, government is taking away my tax, so my I am not getting real income. Why should I contribute more? But you are holding a big position and you are not showing interest to do work. So in that case, ideally to stop this perverse impact or adverse impact on your work incentive, your leisure should be taxed, the other component, so that you cannot switch from work to leisure. But that is not possible. You cannot tax the leisure. So that kind of complication arises in case of direct tax. Now, when we are in direct tax, all these things should be included together. Unfortunately, India, we do not impose the agricultural income tax. Otherwise, that should be added here also, that agricultural income. Of course, in some states, they say that we are collecting tax from the horticulture commodities, the cash crops. But again, that has been very, very ineffective in India. But some states have attempted to collect some tax from agriculture. But generally, we do not get much. We collect the corporation income tax, then the consumption taxes like value-added tax, GST, and the wealth taxes and deficit finance. So in public finance, we discuss in details everything: how income tax should be imposed, how corporation tax should be imposed, what would be the optimal rate of corporation tax, what would be the optimal rate of income tax, whether you should have three slabs of tax or four slabs. Then if it is a corporation tax, whether you should pay the tax on dividend or not. And if it is a dividend, whether dividend should be taxed at the corporation level or at individual level, because dividend is being distributed by the company. Now, whether the company should pay the tax on the dividend or the people who are getting the dividend should pay the tax. And you will find, if you look at the tax reform in India from 1947 till date, you will find that this has changed in between. Sometimes the company is asked to pay, sometimes individuals are asked to pay the tax on the dividends. Who should pay? So these are the things, those are again discussed, whether corporate tax should be 5 layer or 6 layers, or what should be the nature of corporate tax, corporation tax for Indian corporate sector, foreign companies. Now, all those things actually will be discussed in this theory. Consumption tax. Now we are discussing the value added and GST, but before value added tax or GST, we had different other forms of tax. Like we started with unit tax, then we moved towards the ad valorem tax, then we moved towards mod VAT, then we moved towards value added tax, then GST. So like that, it has evolved, and those are also discussed. Like which tax is good, whether it is a unit tax or a specific tax, or a ad valorem tax, or a value-added tax, or a goods and services tax. We had a separate tax for the services, we had a separate tax for the goods, and so now those are merged. So those are also discussed in theories. What is the effect of a value-added tax? What is the effect of a goods and services tax? So all those things we are discussing in those theories. Then wealth tax, of course, in India, now wealth tax has been abolished. That's quite unfortunate, in fact, because wealth tax is basically more helpful in reducing the income gap, because now what is happening, the wealth is getting concentrated with a few people, because in India we do not have a high inheritance tax. So what happens, the father or mother can transfer the wealth to their children, but children without doing anything get all these things. So your birth should not determine your level of richness. Eh, but unfortunately, that happens in India. Even if you have not anything, you have failed in your schooling or in college, but that doesn't matter because your father has so much of wealth. Okay? and that also gives a lot of incentive to the politicians. Sorry, not only politicians actually, to many people actually to accumulate more and more black wealth and transfer it to their children, because inheritance tax is very very less. But in many rich countries, the wealth tax is very high, and that is why we will see that many people in advanced countries give away their wealth to some charitable foundations. They do a lot of activities because very few people transfer their entire wealth to their children, and if at all they do, then there will be huge inheritance tax. So that will reduce the inequality level. But in India, that does not exist, and recently we have abolished this. The reason is that it is difficult to measure the wealth. That is the primary reason. And government believes that by taxing a higher rate on the people who earn more, basically through imposition of a surcharge, that people who earn more than a crore pay a surcharge, and that's how government feels that by imposing a surcharge, we can reduce this inequality. And then in theory also in public finance, we discuss the deficit finance. That means if the revenue falls short of the expenditure, there is a deficit. Now, how should the government finance this? Okay, whether it should go for printing money, whether it should borrow from the market. If it should borrow, then whether it should be long-term borrowing or it should be short-term borrowing, whether it should go to market, or again whether it should be domestic borrowing or external borrowing. If it is external borrowing, whether it should borrow from the multilateral agencies like World Bank or SM Development Bank, or it should borrow from some other country directly. So those things are discussed in deficit finance. Then within the domestic borrowing, whether it should borrow from the market or it should borrow from the public provident funds or it should borrow from LIC. So all those things are discussed in deficit finance. And in a critical time like COVID, now the state governments are going through a very difficult situation, and we know that a lot of controversy has arisen on the borrowing. You must be remembering that GST compensation issue, how a lot of debates happened. That the same borrowing, now the center asked to state that you can borrow from this, but states has protested. So that means there is a lot of implication on borrowing. Okay, that means if state borrows, it has a different implication. If center borrows, it has a different implication. So all those things are basically discussed theoretically in the deficit finance. Then in public finance, we also discuss fiscal federalism. Now, what is fiscal federalism? That we have governments at different levels. We have government at national level, we have government at state level, and then we also have government at the local level. After the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment, these local governments have got power, and panchayats have been given 29 powers. Urban local bodies have been given 18 powers, but unfortunately, the states are not transferring those powers. Okay, so those are again discussed in public finance. And then when we decide the size of the government, uh, how that is decided, what should be the size of the panchayat, that is basically the size of the local government, is also discussed in the theory. And remember, there are different parts. There are certain national level local public goods, there are certain state level public, and there are local level public goods. Now, which public goods should be provided by whom? For example, street light cannot be provided or should not be provided by the national government. Street light should be provided by the local government. So there are theories behind it. It's not that simple that you randomly give certain things to the local governments. Similarly, why income tax was given to the national government? Why not to the state government? Because there is a reason that people may get education somewhere, people may be born somewhere, but they may do income somewhere. People may get transferred from one place to the other. So if you give this taxation rights to the states, then it will have a very different implications. So the taxes, those are mobile in nature, are given to the union government. So those are basically the theories that what taxes should be imposed by which level of government. Similarly, what public goods should be provided by which level of government. Defense should be provided by the national government. It cannot be provided by the state government because there will be lack of coordination. Similarly, you must remember also that the center list and state list although was then created in the beginning, but those are also based on certain theories, okay, that these functions should be delivered by the local government or the state government. Sorry, of course, in the division of power, there is only union list, state list, and concurrent list. It doesn't talk about the local government. But for that, we had separate amendments, 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment. So those are discussed. The size of the optimal government, the taxes, the public goods that should be provided by the local government. Then we also discussed theory of grants, whether that grant should be conditional or unconditional, it should be tied grant or untied grant. See, when center gives money to the states or the panchayats, what should be the nature of the grant? That there is a theory behind. Sometimes government says no, that is a central scheme. There are central sponsored schemes. Usually in central scheme, those are basically directly all the money comes from the center. Those are spent by the states. That is one form of grant. The other form would be that center gives 50%, state has to give 50%. The other grant is that center is giving all the money and state decides how to spend. So that means there are different types of grants coming from the center, and there are also theories behind it. Which form of grant is a better form? That is also discussed. Okay? And you cannot say that something is good or bad because depending upon your requirement. See, if government wants to increase the consumption of certain public good, then conditional grant is good. So, for example, if you give money to the states and ask them that you spend wherever you want, then many states may not spend money for education. They may spend money for something else. But it is important for the state government or in a country like India that all people living in the entire country should get free education. Now, if you are giving money to states and not imposing a condition, states may not spend money for education. They may spend something for something else, which will maximize the votes. So, in that case, conditional grant is a better one. But theory also says that unconditional grant maximizes the general welfare of the people. So these are again conflicting, okay? And those are basically discussed in theory of grants. Then center-state relation. For that, we discuss the Finance Commission, how Finance Commission or Planning Commission in India have transferred resources. Now, what are the welfare implications? Whether 15th Finance Commission recommendation is better than 14th Finance Commission or not? Whether Finance Commission should give grant heads or tied grant or untied grants. Those are also discussed. So those are discussed in center-state relations. And then comes theory of public choice. Public choice is actually is going beyond the taxation and the expenditure because traditionally we discuss that government is a benevolent entity. Okay, and that's why all the time we see that no government can do it. And whenever there is a crisis, we always argue that government should do this. So we always give a rosy picture, of the government, but that is not true. Okay? In fact, there is a quote used in public in the role of the government that what should be the optimal size of the government, whether it should be too small or too big. In fact, if the government becomes very powerful, then it can crush the individuals. Okay, and that has happened. In fact, you can see in the recent months or years what is happening in different states. How there is a conflict between the media and the states. No, there are different examples. I do not have to. I do not need to give the names. That is happening within our state. That is happening elsewhere. That conflict is arising, okay, and how the state is becoming coercive on the media, which should also function independently. That is not happening. So, in such a case, too much of government is also a bad thing. Okay, that it can cross the liberty of the individuals. Okay, like again, we are hearing that sometimes some people are arrested for giving an opinion. That is unfortunate. That if in this country we have freedom to express ourselves, and if due to expression of opinion which is conflicting the government's idea, and government is putting them behind bars. But that is not true, because I have told you in earlier lectures that government is not the nation. Nation is a much bigger concept or idea than the government. Government is only representing us, and it is trying to serve us. That does not mean that government is the nation. Nation is a much bigger concept. And government can fail, government can try to maximize the benefit of the political party. So that doesn't, or a few people, government can only serve a few section of the society. So in that case, there should be opposition in a country or in a nation. And if that does not happen, then the government may not maximize the welfare of the nation or the people. So, okay, those are basically discussing for a public choice, that whether the government represents the preferences of the people. And I have told you also in some other lecture that theory of public choice basically discusses how the preference of the individuals can be aggregated, so that a social preference can be arrived at, and the public goods can be provided appropriately. Because if you know the social preference, then only you can provide the public good. But unfortunately, there are different theories which say that it is very difficult to arrive at a social preference, because any form of the voting system, we follow a voting system that is majority voting, and there are other voting system, both the count voting, based on the ranks. Any form of government does not fulfill the criteria that is required to arrive at a social preference score. No, in fact, if you look at India's democracy also, when the political party wins the election, that party comes to power with only 33 or hardly no 30 percentage vote. Okay, so that means they do not get the support of 70% of the people, but still they are ruling the country. Okay, similarly, they might be ruling the state. Okay, so that means it is the preference of 30% people that is imposed on rest 70% people. Okay, so that is happening in the present voting system that we are following in India. And so that means the government that rules us might not be representing the welfare of the people, or the social preference is not reflected by the government. So those are also discussed. Similarly, what political strategy can be adopted by the government, that is also discussed here, because the strategy adopted by the government might not be maximizing the welfare of the people. That might be maximizing the votes of the political party to remain in the power again and again. So those are actually discussed. Earlier, we thought that the government is very benevolent. They serve our purpose. They reflect our preferences. So that is not the case. Okay? So such a viewpoint can lead to rather different conclusions from the conventional public finance. Okay? And a policy that emerges from the legislative process may look quite different from the original proposal, and one should take this into effect in formulating the recommendations. So we know there are of course a lot of dimensions to the public choice, and people like Amartya Sen, Kaushik Basu, and a very famous economist from Odisha, Prasant Patnaik. They have worked in this theory. Prasant Patnaik is a student of Amartya Sen, and of course he is no more an Indian. He has become an American now. He worked quite for a long time in University of California, Berkeley, and he has become now American citizen. But he is a great theoretician in the theory of public choice, okay? And so they deal with all these things. So I think that's all. So the reference that I have followed is this. I think you can also download it from the internet if you wish. Of course, this reference does not give all the things example that we discussed, but you can get the idea from that. That's all. Thank you. With this, we shall conclude today's lecture.